The latte art looked perfect, swirling cream forming a delicate leaf pattern as Autumn Morris lifted the cup to her lips. She was just another face in the crowded Prague cafe, invisible among the morning rush of students and office workers. The barista had smiled when handing over her usual order, but it wasn't until she set the cup down that she saw it. A small piece of paper tucked beneath the saucer. 3 words that would shatter her carefully constructed ordinary life. Sleeper activated. Now. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. For 24 years, Autumn had been the overlooked librarian's assistant, the quiet girl who organized files and answered phones. But as her hands trembled around that note, every suppressed memory, every buried instinct, every skill she'd forced herself to forget came flooding back. Because Autumn Morris wasn't just a librarian's assistant. She was something far more dangerous, and today, someone had just awakened what she'd spent years trying to bury. The Charles University Library stood like a fortress of knowledge in the heart of Prague, its Gothic spires piercing the crisp morning sky. Inside, between towering shelves that held centuries of human wisdom, Autumn Morris moved like a ghost through her daily routine. At 24, she possessed the kind of forgettable beauty that made people's eyes slide past her. Average height, mousy brown hair always pulled back in a practical bun, wire-rimmed glasses that she didn't actually need but wore because they made her appear even more unremarkable. "Autumn, darling, could you please organize the returned periodicals?" Dr. Helena Novak's voice carried the particular tone reserved for addressing servants. The head librarian, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and an imperious manner, had never bothered to learn that Autumn held degrees in linguistics, computer science, and international relations from some of Europe's most prestigious universities. To Dr. Novak, Autumn was simply the assistant who had appeared 3 years ago with impeccable references and an almost supernatural ability to make herself invisible. Every morning at 7:15 a.m., Autumn's alarm would sound. Not because she needed it, but because maintaining a normal routine was essential to her cover. She'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of mediocrity, and every detail mattered. She would shower for exactly 8 minutes, dress in the same rotation of unremarkable cardigans and sensible skirts, and prepare a simple breakfast while listening to Czech radio news with the kind of casual attention that any assimilated expatriate might display. The walk to work was a masterclass in deliberate invisibility. Autumn had mapped 17 different routes between her modest apartment in Vinohrady and the university library, but she took the same path every day. Through Wenceslas Square, past the National Museum, down Napriope toward Old Town. She walked at precisely the pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. Stopping at the same newsstand to buy a Czech newspaper she would skim but never fully read, nodding politely to the same street vendors who had come to recognize her as a harmless fixture in their daily landscape. But beneath this carefully choreographed normalcy, Autumn's training remained painfully active. She couldn't stop herself from cataloging exit routes from every building she entered, from memorizing the license plates of cars that appeared too frequently in her peripheral vision, from automatically scanning crowds for faces that might recognize hers. These habits were so deeply ingrained that suppressing them required conscious effort, like trying not to breathe. At the library, her days followed a rigid structure that she designed to be both productive and mind-numbing. She would spend the morning processing returns, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions while her mind struggled not to engage with the more interesting aspects of her environment. The afternoon was reserved for assisting researchers, a task that should have been intellectually stimulating, but which she deliberately approached with studied incompetence. "I'm sorry, I don't really understand what you're looking for," she would tell graduate students seeking obscure historical documents, even when she could have directed them to exactly the right sources within minutes. Perhaps you could try the card catalog, she would suggest, pointing to systems she knew were incomplete when she could have accessed the digital archives that contained precisely what they needed. This performance of mediocrity was exhausting. Autumn possessed a photographic memory and could speak 7 languages fluently, but she forced herself to appear confused by simple filing systems and to struggle with basic computer operations. When Dr. Novak would assign her tasks that any competent librarian could complete in minutes, Autumn would take hours, deliberately making small errors that required correction. The most challenging part wasn't the intellectual restraint, it was the social isolation. Her colleagues' conversations washed over her like background noise, discussions of weekend plans and television shows and romantic dramas that felt utterly foreign to someone who had once received briefings on international terrorism cells over breakfast. When they complained about minor inconveniences, a delayed metro train, a difficult customer, a computer that wouldn't start, Autumn had to bite her tongue against observations that would reveal how little these problems actually mattered. "You're so lucky you don't have to deal with the stress we do," Marie once told her, unaware that Autumn had once spent 48 hours in a Romanian basement believing she might never see daylight again. "Your job is so simple and peaceful." Simple and peaceful. If only it were true. Every day required Autumn to perform a delicate balancing act between maintaining her cover and managing the psychological toll of intellectual stagnation. She had been trained to solve complex problems under pressure, to think several moves ahead of opponents who wanted her dead. Now she spent her days alphabetizing book returns and pretending not to understand basic database queries. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had once been considered so valuable that 3 different intelligence agencies had competed for her services. Now she was valued primarily for her ability to remember which shelf housed the 18th century theological texts and whether Professor Swoboda had returned his borrowed copy of Medieval Trade Routes in Central Europe. But this routine had kept her alive for 3 years. Every boring day was a victory. Every moment of tedium was proof that she had successfully disappeared from the radar of people who might want to find her. The price of this safety was the slow suffocation of everything that had once made her feel alive. But Autumn had long ago decided that boredom was a luxury worth protecting. She just hadn't expected that protection to be so fragile, or that it would end with a simple note tucked beneath a coffee cup on an ordinary Tuesday morning. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. What Dr. Novak and our colleagues never discovered was how Autumn spent her evenings after leaving the library. While they assumed she went home to a quiet dinner and perhaps some light reading, Autumn's nights were dedicated to maintaining skills that could mean the difference between life and death if her past ever caught up with her. Her apartment in Vinarati appeared unremarkable from the outside, a modest 2-bedroom flat in a building full of young professionals and university students. But Autumn had chosen it carefully. The building had 4 different exit routes, including access to the roof and a service tunnel that connected to the neighboring block. Her second bedroom wasn't furnished as a guest room. Instead, it housed equipment that would have impressed intelligence analysts from 3 different continents. Every night after work, Autumn would transform from meek librarian's assistant into something far more dangerous. She maintained a rigorous physical training regimen that kept her in peak condition, an hour of combat conditioning, 30 minutes of weapons training using modified equipment that wouldn't attract attention from neighbors, and flexibility exercises that ensured she could still fit through spaces and assume positions that might save her life. Her computer setup was equally sophisticated. Behind the innocent facade of academic research, Autumn monitored intelligence chatter from across Europe, She'd built a network of encrypted connections that allowed her to track the movements of former colleagues, the status of operations she'd once been involved in, and most importantly, any indication that someone might be looking for her. The irony wasn't lost on her that she used skills developed for hunting others to avoid being hunted herself. Language maintenance was another crucial element of her preparation. While she spoke Czech fluently enough to maintain her cover, Autumn spent an hour each evening practicing the 6 other languages that had once been her professional tools: Russian, Arabic, German, French, Mandarin, and Serbian. Each one represented access to different networks, different sources of information, different possibilities for escape if her current identity was compromised. But perhaps the most important aspect of her hidden preparation was psychological conditioning. Autumn had spent 3 years teaching herself to suppress the hypervigilance that had kept her alive during her operational years, but she couldn't afford to lose those instincts entirely. So each night, she would practice switching between her librarian persona and her operational mindset, like an actor rehearsing 2 completely different roles. She'd created detailed contingency plans for dozens of scenarios. If her cover was blown, she had 3 different extraction routes mapped out, each leading to a different safe house where she'd stockpiled money, documents, and equipment. If she needed to disappear quickly, she could become any of 4 different identities within 6 hours. If someone from her past found her, she'd prepared psychological profiles and tactical assessments for the most likely candidates. The most complex part of her preparation involved staying current with technological developments in the intelligence world. The field evolved rapidly, and 3 years away from active duty was an eternity in terms of new surveillance techniques, communication methods, and operational protocols. Autumn couldn't afford to become obsolete, so she developed methods for staying informed that appeared to be nothing more than academic research into cybersecurity and information systems. Her cover as a librarian's assistant was actually perfect for this kind of research. She had legitimate access to academic databases. She could request specialized technical documents without raising suspicion, and her job required her to be familiar with information management systems that weren't too different from the tools used by intelligence agencies. What made her preparation truly impressive was how completely she'd hidden it from everyone around her. Her neighbors saw a quiet young woman who kept to herself and occasionally had groceries delivered. Her colleagues saw someone who struggled with basic technology and seemed overwhelmed by anything more complex than alphabetizing. Even her landlord, who had access to her apartment for repairs, would find nothing more suspicious than a modest collection of language learning materials and fitness equipment. But Autumn knew that all this preparation might not be enough. The intelligence world was unforgiving, and people with her knowledge and experience rarely got to simply walk away. She'd always known that someone, someday, might come looking for her. She just hoped that day would never come. The note tucked beneath her coffee cup proved that hope had been naive. After 3 years of careful preparation, someone had found her. The question now was whether all her hidden training would be enough to survive whatever came next. The first indication that something was wrong came during what should have been an ordinary staff meeting on a rainy Thursday morning in October. Dr. Novak had called all library personnel into the conference room, her expression more serious than usual as she stood before the assembled group of librarians, assistants, and security staff. "I've received word from university administration," Dr. Novak began, her voice carrying an edge that Autumn had never heard before. "There have been some security concerns raised about certain academic materials in our collection. Effective immediately, access to our special archives will be restricted to senior staff only." Autumn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. The special archives contained exactly the kind of historical intelligence documents and diplomatic correspondence that someone looking for her might want to examine. Documents that could potentially contain references to operations she'd been involved in, or clues about the identities she'd used during her operational years. "What kind of security concerns?" asked Dr. Svoboda, the senior research librarian. His question echoed what Autumn was thinking, though she was careful to appear only mildly interested. "Industrial espionage, potentially," Dr. Novak replied vaguely. "There have been reports of unauthorized individuals attempting to access sensitive historical materials at universities across the region. We're simply taking precautionary measures." The meeting continued with discussions of new access protocols and security procedures, but Autumn's mind was racing. Industrial espionage was a convenient cover story, but she recognized the patterns of the security sweep. Someone was looking for something, or someone, and they were using official channels to do it. What made the situation worse was the way Dr. Novak's new restrictions specifically excluded Autumn from any involvement in the special archives. Not only was she banned from accessing the materials herself, she wasn't even allowed to process paperwork related to special collection requests. "Autumn, dear, this won't affect your daily duties much," Dr. Novak said after the meeting, her tone carrying a dismissiveness that felt more pointed than usual. "You'll continue with regular circulation and basic research assistance. The restricted materials are really beyond your level of clearance anyway." Beyond her level of clearance. If Dr. Novak only knew that Autumn had once held security clearances that would have given her access to intelligence briefings for heads of state. But that was exactly the point. She wasn't supposed to know. And the fact that someone was now implementing security measures that specifically excluded her suggested that her cover might be compromised. The exclusion became more apparent over the following days. Autumn noticed that she was no longer assigned to assist researchers working on historical projects that might involve government documents. When Professor Martinez requested materials related to Cold War diplomatic correspondence, Dr. Novak personally handled the request instead of passing it to Autumn as she normally would have. More troubling were the subtle changes in how her colleagues treated her. Marie, who had always been friendly despite their different personalities, seemed more distant. When Autumn entered the staff break room, conversations would pause awkwardly before resuming with forced casualness. She caught people watching her when they thought she wasn't looking, their expressions puzzled rather than suspicious, as if they were trying to solve a riddle they didn't understand. The most unsettling moment came when she overheard a conversation between Dr. Svoboda and Dr. Novak near the rare book section. They were speaking in hushed tones, but Autumn's trained hearing caught fragments that made her blood run cold. Asked specifically about staff with linguistics backgrounds. Background check came back with some irregularities. Recommend limiting her access until we know more. Autumn forced herself to continue shelving books as if she hadn't heard anything, but internally, alarms were screaming. Background checks with irregularities meant that someone was digging into her false identity. The fact that they'd specifically asked about linguistics backgrounds suggested they had some idea of what they were looking for. That afternoon, when Dr. Novak informed her that she would no longer be working with international researchers or handling any materials in languages other than Czech and English, Autumn knew her time was running out. They were systematically isolating her from anything that might reveal her true capabilities or provide her with useful intelligence about what was happening. The exclusion felt like walls closing in around her carefully constructed life. Every restriction, every suspicious glance, every hushed conversation pushed her further into a corner where her only options would be to run or fight. Neither choice would allow her to maintain the peaceful existence she'd built in Prague. But perhaps the most painful part of the exclusion was realizing how little her colleagues actually knew her. They were treating her with the nervous politeness reserved for someone who might be dangerous, but they had no idea who she really was or what she was actually capable of. To them, she was still just Autumn the assistant, but now she was Autumn the assistant who might be involved in something questionable. If they only knew that their suspicions were both completely wrong and perfectly justified. The whispers started on a Friday afternoon when Autumn was organizing returns near the main circulation desk. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Her trained hearing simply picked up conversations that her colleagues assumed were private. What she heard made her realize that speculation about her had become the library's primary source of entertainment. "I'm telling you, there's something off about her," Marie was saying to Jana, the graduate student who worked part-time in acquisitions. They were standing behind the reference desk, their voices low but not nearly quiet enough to escape Autumn's attention. "Yesterday, I asked her to help me translate a German document, and she acted like she'd never seen the language before. But I swear I've heard her answer the phone in German when she thought no one was listening." Jana glanced in Autumn's direction, then back to Marie. "Maybe she's just shy about her language skills. Some people are like that." "Or maybe she's hiding something bigger," Marie replied. "Think about it. She appears out of nowhere 3 years ago with perfect references but no real personal history that anyone can verify. She never talks about her past, never mentions family or friends from before Prague. When's the last time you heard her take a personal phone call?" The conversation continued, but Autumn forced herself to focus on the books in her hands. Marie's observations were uncomfortably accurate. She had been careful to maintain her cover, but perhaps too careful. In trying to avoid revealing her true capabilities, she'd created a pattern of behavior that was suspicious in its own way. Later that afternoon, she overheard Dr. Svoboda talking to one of the visiting researchers, a portly German professor who specialized in Eastern European diplomatic history. They were discussing her within earshot, apparently assuming that she wouldn't understand their German conversation. "The assistant is quite limited," Dr. Svoboda was saying in German. "Pleasant enough, but not particularly bright. Helena keeps her around because she's reliable for basic tasks, but I wouldn't trust her with anything complex. Yesterday she claimed she couldn't read a simple Russian document title, which seems unlikely for someone with her educational background." The German professor glanced at Autumn, who was carefully maintaining an expression of polite incomprehension while internally translating every word they spoke. "Perhaps she's nervous about making mistakes. Some people prefer to claim ignorance rather than risk being wrong." "Possibly," Dr. Svoboda agreed. "Though between you and me, I suspect her academic credentials might be somewhat enhanced. These days, young people sometimes exaggerate their qualifications to get positions they're not really suited for." Autumn continued sorting books, her face a mask of bland concentration while internally cataloging the irony. If anything, she had dramatically understated her qualifications. The degrees on her resume were real, but they represented only a fraction of her actual education and training. She spoke German fluently enough to teach it at university level, could read Russian as easily as Czech, and had once written intelligence briefings in both languages. The most painful conversation came later that week when she overheard Dr. Novak speaking with someone on the phone, presumably a university administrator based on the formal tone and content of the discussion. "No, I don't believe she poses any real security risk. She's simply not capable of the kind of sophisticated analysis that would make her valuable to industrial espionage operations. Frankly, I'm not sure how she managed to get her current position. Her performance has been adequate, but hardly impressive." There was a pause as Dr. Novak listened to the person on the other end of the call. "Limited intellectual capacity, I would say. She struggles with basic research tasks and seems overwhelmed by anything requiring critical thinking. If someone recruited her for intelligence gathering, they would be profoundly disappointed by what she could actually deliver." Autumn felt a complex mixture of relief and offense. Dr. Novak's assessment would hopefully discourage anyone looking for a sophisticated intelligence operative, but it was still jarring to hear herself described as intellectually limited by someone she could have intellectually outmaneuvered without effort. The doubt reached its peak during a staff meeting the following Monday when Dr. Novak announced new security protocols with obvious reluctance. Unfortunately, recent guidelines from university administration require us to implement additional background verification for all staff with access to sensitive materials. This is purely administrative and shouldn't be seen as reflecting on anyone's trustworthiness. But the way her colleagues avoided eye contact with Autumn made it clear that everyone understood who was really being investigated. She had become the subject of collective suspicion, though no one seemed quite sure what they suspected her of. After the meeting, she heard fragments of conversation that revealed how thoroughly her reputation had been transformed. Words like mysterious, secretive, and possibly dishonest were being applied to someone they'd previously seen as merely boring and incompetent. The final blow came when she overheard young Marcus, the graduate student whose questions about security systems had originally caught her attention, talking to another student near the periodical section. I feel sorry for her, honestly. Everyone's treating her like she's some kind of criminal mind master, but she's obviously just a simple person who got caught up in something she doesn't understand. Look at her. Does she seem capable of international espionage? She can barely operate the copy machine properly. The cruel irony was that Marcus was probably the most dangerous person in the building, but his assessment of her capabilities was exactly what she had worked 3 years to achieve. She had successfully convinced everyone that she was harmless and incompetent. The problem was that this perception, which had once protected her, was now being used to justify treating her as a security risk who was too limited to even understand why she was being investigated.
While her colleagues whispered and her supervisors implemented new restrictions, Autumn's response was to intensify the very preparations that had kept her alive for 3 years. Every night after work, she returned to her apartment and methodically strengthened the foundation of skills and knowledge that might soon be her only protection against whatever was coming. The background investigation Dr. Novak had mentioned was progressing. Autumn could tell by the subtle changes in how people interacted with her and the increasingly specific questions that were being asked about her work history. Someone was definitely digging into her false identity, which meant she had limited time before her cover was either completely blown or officially cleared. Neither outcome seemed likely to end well. In response to this mounting pressure, Autumn made her evening training sessions more intensive and more focused. Instead of the general conditioning she'd maintained for 3 years, she began preparing for specific scenarios. If she needed to run, how quickly could she reach each of her prepared extraction routes? If she needed to defend herself, which weapons could she improvise from common household items? If she needed to disappear completely, what would be the most efficient method for destroying evidence of her current identity? Her intelligence gathering became more aggressive as well. Using her access to academic databases and her legitimate research credentials, Autumn began investigating the patterns of security sweeps happening at universities across Central Europe. What she discovered was troubling. Someone was conducting a systematic search for individuals with very specific skill sets: linguistics, international relations, computer security, and what the reports euphemistically called crisis management experience. The search parameters were broad enough to avoid triggering obvious alarms, but specific enough that anyone with Autumn's background would eventually be identified. Whoever was looking for her, or people like her, was being very sophisticated about it. This wasn't a random investigation or a simple security review. Someone knew exactly what they were hunting. Even more concerning was what Autumn discovered about the timeline. The investigation at Charles University wasn't the beginning of the search. It was part of a coordinated effort that had been ongoing for months. Universities in Vienna, Budapest, Warsaw, and Berlin had all implemented similar security reviews within the past 6 months. The net was closing systematically across the region. This realization prompted Autumn to accelerate her preparations in ways that required extraordinary discipline. She began liquidating assets that couldn't be quickly transported, converting everything possible into forms of wealth that would be useful if she needed to disappear. She updated her emergency identities, ensuring that documentation was current and that the financial resources attached to each identity remained accessible. Most importantly, she began practicing the psychological transition that would be necessary if she had to abandon her carefully constructed peaceful existence. For 3 years, she'd worked to suppress the hypervigilance and operational thinking that had defined her previous life. Now she had to prepare for the possibility that those survival instincts would need to be reactivated instantly. The mental preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of her quiet determination. Autumn had genuinely enjoyed her life as a librarian's assistant, even with its limitations and frustrations. She'd found peace in the routine, satisfaction in helping researchers find obscure information, even a kind of friendship with colleagues who knew nothing about her real past. The prospect of losing all of that was genuinely painful, but pain was a luxury she couldn't afford if her situation deteriorated further. So she spent her evenings not just maintaining her physical and technical capabilities, but also rebuilding the emotional detachment that had once allowed her to make life or death decisions without hesitation. She practiced viewing her current life as simply another operational cover, something that could be discarded if necessary for survival. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same skills that had once made her valuable to intelligence agencies were now being used to protect her from those same organizations. The patience, attention to detail, and long-term strategic thinking that had made her an effective operative were now focused on staying one step ahead of people who might want to either recruit her or eliminate her. What gave her hope was the realization that her 3 years of enforced normalcy had actually made her more dangerous, not less. She'd learned how to operate without the extensive support networks and advanced technology that most intelligence operatives relied on. She'd developed the ability to blend into civilian environments so completely that even trained investigators struggled to identify her as a threat. Her quiet determination wasn't just about maintaining her cover. It was about proving to herself that she could control her own destiny. For too many years, her life had been shaped by the demands and decisions of others. Handlers who assigned her missions, supervisors who managed her operations, agencies that treated her as a valuable but ultimately expendable asset. Now, for the first time in her adult life, Autumn was operating entirely for herself. Every preparation she made, every contingency she planned, every skill she maintained was aimed at preserving her own freedom and safety. The stakes couldn't be higher, but neither could her motivation. As she finalized her preparations each night, Autumn would remind herself that survival wasn't just about escaping immediate threats. It was about maintaining the possibility of building something lasting and meaningful. She'd tasted the peace of an ordinary life, and she was determined to preserve the chance of finding that peace again, even if it meant temporarily becoming everything she'd tried to leave behind.
The crisis began not with the coffee shop note, but 3 days earlier, when Autumn noticed that her carefully monitored intelligence networks had gone silent. The encrypted channels she used to track former colleagues and ongoing operations simply stopped updating, as if someone had systematically cut the connections she'd spent years establishing. This wasn't the gradual fade of sources going dark. It was the digital equivalent of having doors slammed shut across Europe simultaneously. That same morning, she discovered that her emergency financial accounts had been frozen. Not closed, not emptied, frozen, which meant someone with significant authority was investigating her resources. When she attempted to access backup funds through her secondary identity, those accounts showed similar restrictions. Whoever was closing in on her had resources that extended far beyond university security reviews. The third alarm came when Autumn realized she was being actively surveilled, not by amateurs or local security, but by professionals who knew how to track someone with her training. She spotted the first watcher on Tuesday morning, a woman in her 30s who appeared at 3 different locations along Autumn's route to work, always with plausible reasons for being there, but maintaining the kind of positioning that allowed for continuous observation. By Wednesday, there were at least 4 different operatives in rotation, which meant someone was committing serious resources to monitoring her movements. They were good, better than the usual corporate security or local law enforcement that might investigate a suspicious library employee. These were intelligence professionals, and their presence meant that her situation had escalated far beyond what Dr. Novak's background checks could explain. The final confirmation came when Autumn discovered that her apartment building was under surveillance. The building across the street had acquired new tenants with suspiciously clean windows that provided perfect sightlines into her unit. The pattern of lights in those windows followed the professional rhythms of shift changes rather than the irregular schedule of actual residents. But the most terrifying realization was that despite all this attention, she still didn't know who was hunting her or why. Her former handlers had always been clear about the terms of her extraction from operational status: complete severance with no future contact, but also no pursuit as long as she remained inactive. Someone had apparently decided those terms no longer applied. The breakthrough came on Wednesday evening, when Autumn intercepted a coded transmission using equipment she'd hoped never to use again. The message was brief and chilling. Target confirmed in Prague. Sleeper protocol authorized. Activation imminent. Sleeper protocol. The term sent ice through her veins because she knew exactly what it meant. During her operational years, sleeper protocols were used to reactivate retired assets for high-priority missions. The process bypassed normal recruitment channels and consent procedures. Once the protocol was authorized, the target's cooperation was assumed to be compulsory, whether they wanted to return to operational status or not. Someone wasn't just hunting her for investigation or elimination. They wanted to force her back into service. And activation imminent meant she had hours, not days, before they made their move. The cruel irony was that after 3 years of successfully hiding from her past, Autumn's operational skills were being dragged back into the light by the very people who had trained her to use them. All her careful preparation, all her quiet determination to build a peaceful life was about to be tested by forces that viewed her not as a person seeking retirement, but as a valuable asset that could be reclaimed at will. That night, as Autumn sat in her apartment surrounded by surveillance she couldn't escape and monitoring equipment that confirmed her worst fears, she realized that her choices had been narrowed to 2 equally terrible options. She could run, abandoning everything she'd built in Prague and spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, never knowing when the next sleeper protocol might be activated. Or she could wait for them to make contact and hope that whatever they wanted from her would be survivable. Neither option offered the peace she'd fought so hard to achieve. But as she prepared for what might be her last night as Autumn Morris, librarian's assistant, she reminded herself that survival had always been about adapting to circumstances beyond her control. 3 years ago, she'd successfully transformed from operational asset to invisible civilian. Now she would need to discover what came next. The crisis had emerged not as a single dramatic moment, but as the culmination of forces that had been building for months. Tomorrow would bring the activation that would end her quiet life in Prague, one way or another. The only question was whether she would face it as a victim or as someone who still had some control over her own destiny. As she reviewed her escape routes one final time, Autumn couldn't help but wonder if this had always been inevitable. If people like her were ever really allowed to walk away from the intelligence world, or if they were simply granted temporary leave until their services were required again. When the surveillance teams moved to active containment on Thursday morning, Autumn realized that every conventional escape route she'd prepared was already compromised. The professionals watching her had done their homework. They knew about the service tunnels, the rooftop access, even the emergency exit through the neighboring building's basement that she thought was her secret ace. Her first indication came when she attempted to leave for work through her usual route and spotted checkpoint positions that hadn't been there the night before. Not obvious barriers, but strategically placed observers who could vector pursuit teams toward any direction she might flee. Someone had spent considerable time studying her patterns and preparing countermeasures for every contingency she'd planned. The discovery that her escape routes were blocked prompted Autumn to attempt contact with emergency resources she'd hoped never to need. Hidden in her apartment were communication devices that could reach 3 different extraction networks. intelligence agencies, criminal organizations, and private security firms that specialized in protecting former operatives. Each represented a different type of safety, but also a different type of compromise. Her first attempt was to contact her former handler through a dead-drop system that should have guaranteed secure communication. The response came back within hours. Asset no longer under protection. Contract terminated. Recommend compliance with current operation. The message was devastating, not just because it confirmed her abandonment, but because it revealed that her former agency was aware of the current situation and had chosen not to intervene. The second network, criminal contacts who specialize in moving people across borders without official documentation, proved equally useless. Her contact confirmed that unusual security attention was being paid to transportation hubs across Central Europe, making it nearly impossible to arrange clandestine travel. More troubling, he mentioned that someone had been asking questions about individuals matching her description, suggesting that her pursuers had anticipated and compromised this avenue of escape as well. The third option, private security firms, delivered the most chilling response. The message was brief. Current client has exclusive contract. Alternative arrangements not available. Someone had already hired the firm she might have turned to for protection, either to ensure their services weren't available to her or to use their resources for tracking her down. By Thursday afternoon, Autumn realized that traditional tradecraft solutions wouldn't work because her opponents understood traditional tradecraft as well as she did. They'd systematically eliminated every resource that a former intelligence operative might typically use to escape pursuit. This wasn't a manhunt. It was a carefully orchestrated capture operation designed by people who knew exactly what they were hunting. Her apartment had become effectively a prison. She could leave for normal activities like work, but any attempt to deviate from her established patterns would trigger immediate response from the surveillance teams. They weren't trying to arrest her or eliminate her. They were controlling her movements while they prepared for whatever activation they had planned. The most frustrating aspect was that her professional skills, the very capabilities that had once made her valuable, were now working against her. Every technique she knew for evading surveillance, every method she'd learned for escaping containment had been anticipated and countered by people who'd learned from the same sources or who'd studied her operational history. Even more disturbing was the realization that her 3 years of careful preparation had been largely wasted. The emergency identities she developed were compromised. Attempts to access documentation for her backup personas triggered immediate security flags. The financial resources she'd accumulated were frozen. The safe houses she'd established had been identified and were probably under surveillance. As if her opponents had been watching her for the entire 3 years she'd been in Prague, cataloging every preparation she'd made and developing countermeasures for each one. The prospect that her retirement had never been real, that she'd been allowed to think she was free while actually remaining under observation, was almost more terrifying than the immediate threat. By Thursday evening, Autumn was forced to confront the possibility that resistance might be futile. Her opponents had demonstrated resources, planning, and knowledge that exceeded her ability to counter with the tools available to her. They'd systematically eliminated every conventional option for escape or protection, leaving her with choices that were increasingly desperate and unlikely to succeed. The traditional solutions had failed not because they were poorly planned or inadequately executed, but because they were traditional. Her opponents knew what a former intelligence operative would do when threatened, knew what resources she would try to access, knew what escape routes she would attempt to use. They'd prepared for all of it. This realization forced Autumn to consider options that weren't traditional, approaches that might not occur to people who understood conventional intelligence operations. If her professional training was working against her, perhaps survival lay in abandoning professional approaches entirely and thinking like the civilian she'd been pretending to be for 3 years. But first, she needed to understand exactly what her opponents wanted and why traditional intelligence agencies wouldn't protect someone who had served them faithfully for years. The answers might determine whether unconventional solutions would be any more successful than the traditional ones that had already failed so completely. Friday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. The same gray October sky, the same routine sounds of Prague awakening to another day. Autumn prepared for work with mechanical precision, knowing that this might be the last time she performed these familiar rituals. The surveillance teams were still in position, but their posture had shifted from observation to anticipation. Something was going to happen today. The decision to go to work, despite everything, was itself a choice. Autumn could have tried to run during the night, could have attempted one of her compromised escape routes and hoped for the best. Instead, she chose to maintain her cover until the last possible moment, partly because running would only confirm her opponent's intelligence about her true identity, and partly because she wasn't ready to surrender the life she'd built without understanding what she was surrendering it for. At the library, the atmosphere was charged with tension that had nothing to do with her situation. Dr. Novak was unusually agitated, conducting hushed phone conversations and checking her watch with increasing frequency. Her colleagues seemed nervous, glancing at Autumn with expressions that mixed sympathy and curiosity. It was clear that something had been planned for today, something that involved her, but that everyone else knew more about than she did. The morning passed with surreal normalcy. Autumn processed book returns, assisted researchers with routine queries, and maintained the performance of being a competent but unremarkable library assistant. But beneath the surface, she was conducting her own form of reconnaissance, trying to determine when and how the activation would occur. The answer came at 11:30 a.m., when Dr. Novak approached her desk with an expression of forced casualness. "Autumn, dear, would you mind running an errand for me? I need someone to pick up some documents from a cafe in Old Town. It's quite urgent, and you're the only one available at the moment." The request was obviously manufactured. Dr. Novak had never asked her to run personal errands before, and the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. But Autumn also recognized that this might be her only opportunity to meet her opponents on ground that wasn't completely of their choosing. At the library, she was trapped with no options. In the city, she might have some room to maneuver. "Of course, Dr. Novak," Autumn replied, accepting the address with a smile that felt like wearing a mask. "I'll head over there right away." The walk to Old Town felt like a funeral procession. Autumn was acutely aware of the surveillance teams maintaining their positions around her, but she was also conscious that this might be her last hour of freedom. The cobblestone streets, the Gothic architecture, the familiar sounds of tourist conversations in a dozen languages, all of it might soon become memories of a life she'd never be able to return to. The cafe was small and intimate, the kind of place that attracted locals rather than tourists. Autumn recognized it as an ideal location for a discreet meeting, public enough to avoid suspicion, but quiet enough for private conversation. As she approached the entrance, she made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of entering immediately, she paused outside and sent a text message to Dr. Novak. "Arrived at cafe. Before I go in, I want you to know that I've valued working with you, even if you never understood who I really was." The message would confirm Dr. Novak's suspicions about her true identity, but it would also serve as a form of farewell to the life she was about to lose. If she was going to be forced back into the intelligence world, she wanted there to be some record that Autumn Morris, librarian's assistant, had existed and had chosen to face her fate with dignity. Taking a deep breath, Autumn pushed open the cafe door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with small tables scattered throughout a space that smelled of coffee and fresh pastries. Only a few customers were present, and her trained eye immediately identified which ones were part of the operation and which ones were genuine civilians who would probably be asked to leave soon. She approached the counter where a young man with dark hair and careful eyes was preparing coffee orders. When he looked up and saw her, his expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, but recognition. "What can I get you?" he asked in an accented English, though they were in the Czech Republic and she'd never spoken to him before. "Just a latte, please," Autumn replied in Czech, maintaining her cover identity even though they both knew it was meaningless at this point. The barista began preparing her order with practiced efficiency. As he worked, Autumn noticed that the other customers were quietly leaving, finding excuses to abandon their half-finished drinks and exit the cafe. Within minutes, the space was empty except for herself and the man behind the counter. He finished the latte with elaborate care, creating an intricate leaf pattern in the foam that seemed almost mocking given the circumstances. When he slid the cup across the counter, Autumn could see the edge of a small piece of paper tucked beneath the saucer. "Enjoy," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been satisfaction. Autumn lifted the cup and retrieved the note, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to read. The message was brief, written in block letters that revealed nothing about the author's identity. Sleeper activated, now. She looked up to find the barista watching her with professional interest, waiting to see how she would respond to the moment that ended her civilian life and returned her to a world she'd spent 3 years trying to escape from. This was her moment of truth, the instant when she had to decide whether to accept reactivation or attempt resistance that would probably be futile but might preserve some small measure of self-determination.
Autumn set the coffee cup down with deliberate calm, her eyes never leaving the barista's face as she folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. For a moment, the cafe was silent except for the distant sounds of Prague traffic and the soft hum of the espresso machine. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent years making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "I assume you have something more substantial than a dramatic note to justify interrupting my morning coffee," she said in fluent English, abandoning any pretense of being a confused librarian's assistant. The shift in her demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. Gone was the hesitant, slightly awkward woman her colleagues knew, replaced by someone who commanded attention simply by the way she held herself. The barista's expression shifted to match her changed tone. "Miss Morris, or should I use your operational designation? We have a situation that requires your immediate attention and unique skill set. Your country needs you." Autumn's laugh was sharp and humorless. "My country? Which one would that be? The one that terminated my protection contract 3 days ago? The one that confirmed they wouldn't intervene when I requested emergency assistance? Or perhaps you're referring to some other country that's never shown the slightest interest in my welfare?" She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to the conversational tone that intelligence professionals used for serious negotiations. "Before we continue this performance, let's establish some basic facts. You spent considerable resources tracking me down, compromising my security, and forcing this meeting. That suggests you need something from me that you can't obtain through normal channels. So let's skip the patriotic appeals and discuss what you're actually offering in exchange for my cooperation." The barista, clearly not actually a barista, appeared momentarily off balance. He'd obviously prepared for various scenarios: compliance, fear, denial, even violent resistance. But he hadn't expected calm, professional negotiation from someone who was supposed to be a retired asset with no leverage. "You don't understand the urgency of the situation," he said, reaching beneath the counter to retrieve a tablet computer. "We have intelligence indicating an imminent terrorist operation targeting multiple European capitals. The attack will occur within the next 72 hours, and our analysis suggests that you're the only available operative with the specific language skills and cultural knowledge necessary to penetrate the network responsible." Autumn studied the tablet screen as he turned it toward her, her expression neutral as she absorbed information about what appeared to be a sophisticated terrorist plot. The intelligence was detailed and convincing, the kind of legitimate threat that would justify extraordinary measures. But she'd been in the intelligence world long enough to know that legitimate threats were often used to manipulate cooperation from reluctant assets. "Impressive," she said, after reviewing the materials. "But you're making a fundamental error in your approach. You're treating this as if I'm still an operational asset who can be activated at will. That person hasn't existed for 3 years. What you're looking at now is Autumn Morris, a
a civilian who has no obligation to involve herself in intelligence operations. She closed the tablet and slid it back across the counter. If this threat is as serious as you claim, there are dozens of active operatives who could handle the assignment. The fact that you're approaching a retired asset suggests either that you've exhausted other options or that there are aspects of this operation you haven't disclosed. The barista's professional composure was beginning to crack. Miss Morris, you're correct that we have other operatives available, but none with your specific combination of skills and, more importantly, your particular psychological profile. This operation requires someone who can think independently, who won't hesitate to act outside official protocols if the situation demands it. Autumn felt a chill of recognition. You're not recruiting me for my language skills or cultural knowledge. You're recruiting me because I have a history of disobeying orders when I believe the situation requires it. You want someone who will take responsibility for actions that your organization doesn't want to officially authorize. The truth of her assessment was written across his face before he could formulate a denial. This wasn't about her unique qualifications. It was about her willingness to act without official sanction, to serve as a deniable asset who could be disavowed if the operation went wrong. Autumn stood motionless at the cafe door for exactly 10 seconds, her mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with personal safety and everything to do with the kind of moral mathematics that had once defined her operational career. The man behind her was using emotional manipulation, but that didn't automatically make the threat fabricated. In the intelligence world, legitimate crises were routinely used to coerce cooperation from unwilling assets. She turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. Show me the intercepts, not the analysis, not the summary, the raw intelligence. If you want me to risk my life for this operation, I need to verify that the threat is real and that conventional resources are truly inadequate. For the next 20 minutes, the man, who finally introduced himself as Agent David Kane, provided access to intelligence materials that confirmed Autumn's worst fears. The terrorist network was sophisticated, well-funded, and days away from executing coordinated attacks across Prague, Vienna, and Berlin. More troubling was the evidence that the operation had inside knowledge of European security protocols, suggesting either a serious intelligence breach or active collaboration from someone within official channels. The linguistic and cultural elements of the threat were specifically designed to exploit gaps in traditional counterterrorism resources. The terrorists were using dialect variations and coded references that would be nearly impossible for standard intelligence analysts to interpret accurately. Someone with Autumn's background, particularly her experience with off-book operations in Eastern Europe, represented a unique capability for understanding and interdicting the plot. You're right that this could be handled through official channels, Kane admitted after she'd reviewed the materials. But the timeline doesn't allow for proper coordination between agencies, and the security breach means we can't be certain who to trust within existing structures. We need someone who can operate independently and who understands the cultural context well enough to identify opportunities that official analysts might miss. Autumn closed the final intelligence file and met Kane's eyes with the steady gaze of someone making a decision that would reshape her life. I'll help you stop this attack, but not as a reactivated asset and not under official protocol. If I do this, it's as a freelance security consultant with specific terms that you'll agree to before I take any action. Kane's relief was obvious, but he was also clearly uncomfortable with her conditions. What terms? First, my involvement remains completely deniable. If this operation fails, or if I'm captured, your organization has no knowledge of my participation and no responsibility for my safety. Second, I choose my own methods and timeline. You provide intelligence and logistical support, but you don't direct my actions. Third, when this is over, I return to my life in Prague with a guarantee that I'll never be contacted again for any reason. The agent hesitated, clearly weighing the unusual nature of her demands against the urgency of the situation. Those terms essentially make you an independent contractor rather than an asset we can control. Exactly, Autumn replied. That's the only basis on which I'll participate. You get my expertise and willingness to take risks, but you don't get to treat me as expendable. If that's unacceptable, then I wish you luck with your conventional resources. Kane made a brief phone call, speaking in code that suggested he was clearing her terms with higher authority. When he ended the call, his expression was grim but determined. Agreed. You're officially a freelance security consultant for the next 72 hours. After that, we've never met. What followed was the most intense operational briefing of Autumn's career. The terrorist network had identified 3 targets: an international summit in Prague, a NATO coordination meeting in Vienna, and a European Union security conference in Berlin. The attacks were designed to occur simultaneously, maximizing both casualties and symbolic impact. Intelligence suggested that the operation would begin with reconnaissance activities tonight, followed by final positioning tomorrow and execution within 48 hours. Autumn's role would be to infiltrate the Prague element of the network, using her linguistic skills and cultural knowledge to identify the specific target and timeline for the local attack. Once she had that information, she would need to neutralize the immediate threat while providing intelligence that would allow official authorities to prevent the attacks in Vienna and Berlin. The mission was complex enough to require every skill she'd developed during her operational years, dangerous enough that survival was far from guaranteed, and morally compelling enough that she couldn't walk away knowing she might have prevented thousands of deaths. As Kane provided her with initial equipment and contact protocols, Autumn felt the familiar mental shift that accompanied a return to operational thinking. The careful emotional detachment, the systematic risk assessment, the automatic cataloging of resources and escape routes, all of it came back as if she'd never left the intelligence world. But there was also something different this time. She wasn't acting under orders or to serve someone else's agenda. For the first time in her career, she was choosing to risk her life for reasons that were entirely her own. The mission would be dangerous and the outcome uncertain, but it would be her mission, conducted according to her principles and her methods. As she prepared to leave the cafe and begin the most important operation of her career, Autumn reflected on the irony that her greatest strength as an operative had always been her willingness to act independently when circumstances demanded it. Now that independence would be tested against a threat that could reshape European security if it succeeded.
The infiltration began at sunset in Prague's Venerati district, where intelligence indicated the terrorist cell had established their primary safe house. Autumn approached the operation with methodical precision, using skills she'd maintained during 3 years of retirement, but adapting them to circumstances that were far more complex than any mission she'd undertaken during her official career. Her first challenge was establishing surveillance of the target location without triggering the sophisticated counter-surveillance measures that the terrorists had undoubtedly implemented. Using techniques learned during operations in hostile environments, Autumn spent 4 hours mapping the area around the safe house, identifying patterns of movement, security weaknesses, and potential escape routes that would be crucial if the mission deteriorated rapidly. What she discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The terrorist cell was smaller than intelligence estimates had suggested. Only 4 individuals appeared to be operating from the Prague location. But their operational security was exceptional, suggesting professional training that exceeded what most terrorist organizations could provide. These weren't religious fanatics or political extremists. They were trained operatives conducting a terrorist operation for reasons that probably had more to do with geopolitics than ideology. The linguistic element of her mission proved crucial during the initial reconnaissance phase. Using directional listening equipment that Kane had provided, Autumn was able to intercept fragments of conversation that revealed critical details about the Prague attack. The terrorists were using a dialect of Arabic mixed with technical terms in German and Czech, a combination that would have been nearly incomprehensible to standard intelligence analysts, but which made perfect sense to someone with her background. From these intercepted conversations, Autumn learned that the Prague attack was scheduled for the following evening during a reception at the Hilton Hotel where European security ministers were meeting to discuss counterterrorism coordination. The irony was devastating. The terrorists planned to attack a meeting specifically focused on preventing exactly this kind of operation. But the most alarming discovery was that the attack wouldn't rely on conventional explosives or weapons. Instead, the terrorists had developed a chemical dispersal system that would contaminate the hotel's ventilation system with a nerve agent that would kill everyone in the building within minutes. The sophistication nature of the weapons suggested state sponsorship and access to chemical warfare capabilities that few organizations possessed. Armed with this intelligence, Autumn faced the most challenging decision of the operation. Standard protocol would be to withdraw immediately and provide the information to official authorities who could coordinate an appropriate response. But the timeline was compressed. The security breach meant that official channels might be compromised, and the sophistication of the terrorists suggested that they had contingency plans for dealing with standard counterterrorism responses. Instead, Autumn chose to proceed with direct action. Using equipment and techniques that technically violated about a dozen international laws, she prepared to infiltrate the safe house and neutralize the chemical weapon before it could be deployed. The decision represented everything that had made her valuable as an operative and everything that had made her superiors uncomfortable with her independence. The infiltration itself required every skill she'd developed during her career. The safe house was protected by electronic security systems that took her 40 minutes to bypass, human guards who maintained professional patrol patterns, and physical barriers that required specialized equipment to overcome. But Autumn had spent 3 years maintaining these capabilities specifically for situations where her life might depend on them. The most dangerous moment came when she encountered one of the terrorists unexpectedly while moving through the building. Instead of the combat situation she'd prepared for, Autumn found herself face to face with a young woman who was clearly terrified and possibly being coerced into participation. The realization that the terrorist operation might involve unwilling participants complicated every assumption she'd made about appropriate responses. In the space of 3 seconds, Autumn had to choose between neutralizing a potential threat and attempting to communicate with someone who might be more victim than perpetrator. Her decision to attempt communication rather than immediate violence proved crucial when the woman revealed that the chemical weapon was stored in a separate location and that the safe house was primarily used for coordination rather than weapons storage. This intelligence forced Autumn to completely revise her operational plan. Instead of a single infiltration mission, she now faced a multi-stage operation that would require her to locate and neutralize the chemical weapon while simultaneously preventing the terrorists from executing their attack using conventional methods. The complexity exceeded what any single operative should attempt, but the timeline and circumstances left her no alternative. As she prepared for the most dangerous phase of the operation, Autumn reflected on how different this felt from her previous operational experience. During her official career, she'd always known that support was available if missions deteriorated beyond her ability to manage. Now she was operating entirely alone, with no backup and no extraction plan beyond her own resourcefulness. But there was also a clarity to this independence that she'd never experienced before. Every decision was hers, every risk was calculated according to her own assessment, and every success or failure would be the result of her own capabilities rather than institutional support or bureaucratic limitations. The mission was far from over, but Autumn had proven to herself that 3 years of retirement had not diminished her effectiveness as an operative. If anything, the combination of maintained skills and hard-won independence had made her more dangerous than she'd been during her official career.
The chemical weapon facility was located in an abandoned pharmaceutical plant on the outskirts of Prague, a location that provided both the infrastructure necessary for chemical processing and the isolation required to avoid detection. Autumn's approach required 12 hours of continuous operation, moving between safe-house surveillance, facility reconnaissance, and careful coordination with Kane's support team to ensure that official authorities would be positioned to respond once she'd neutralized the immediate threat. The final phase of the mission began at 3 a.m. when Autumn penetrated the pharmaceutical facility and discovered that the nerve agent production was far more advanced than intelligence had indicated. The terrorists weren't just planning to attack the hotel reception, they'd produced enough chemical weapon to contaminate multiple targets across Prague. The scope of the threat meant that partial success wouldn't be sufficient. She needed to destroy the entire production capability to prevent future attacks. Using demolition techniques that she'd hoped never to employ again, Autumn systematically destroyed the chemical processing equipment, neutralized the stored nerve agent, and eliminated the terrorists' ability to continue their operation. The process required 4 hours of precise work under conditions that would have been lethal if she'd made any significant errors. But the most crucial element of the mission's success wasn't technical. It was the decision to extract the chorus terrorist rather than treating her as a hostile combatant. The young woman, identified as Petra Kovar, a chemistry graduate student whose family had been threatened to ensure her cooperation, provided intelligence that allowed authorities to prevent the Vienna and Berlin attacks before they could be executed. When Czech security forces arrived at dawn to secure the facility, they found Autumn calmly documenting the destroyed equipment and preparing detailed briefing materials that would help investigators understand the full scope of the terrorist network. Her demeanor was professional and competent, but also clearly exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. The aftermath of the operation revealed the extent to which Autumn's independence had been crucial to its success. Official investigations confirmed that the terrorist network had penetrated European security agencies at multiple levels, making conventional counterterrorism responses impossible. Only someone operating outside official channels could have moved quickly enough to prevent the attacks. Kane's final debrief took place in the same cafe where the mission had begun, but the dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. Instead of a handler managing a reluctant asset, he was now consulting with someone who had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded institutional resources. The preliminary assessment suggests that you prevented at least 3,000 casualties and potentially destabilized a state-sponsored terrorism network that had been operating for years, Kane reported. Official channels want to offer you a position that would allow you to continue this kind of work with full institutional support. Autumn's response was immediate and definitive. Thank you, but no. I agreed to help with this specific threat, and that obligation is now complete. I'm returning to my life in Prague with the understanding that this was a one-time engagement. Kane seemed genuinely puzzled by her refusal. You've just demonstrated that you're more effective as an independent operative than most people are with full institutional backing. Why would you want to go back to working in a library? Because effectiveness isn't the only measure of a life worth living. For 3 years, I've experienced what it means to build something constructive rather than just preventing destruction. I've learned that my value as a person isn't limited to my usefulness in crisis situations. But even as she spoke, Autumn recognized that her experience as Autumn Morris, library's assistant, had been permanently altered. She could return to that life, but she would be returning as someone who had proven that her quiet existence was a choice rather than a limitation. The transformation was subtle but profound.
Where she had once hidden her capabilities out of necessity, she could now choose when and how to reveal them. Where she had once feared that her past would destroy her peaceful life, she had learned that her skills could serve peaceful purposes when applied according to her own principles. 6 months later, Autumn stood in the same library where she'd once felt invisible and undervalued. But Dr. Novak's attitude toward her had evolved significantly after the Prague security incident made international news. While the details of Autumn's involvement remained classified, enough information had emerged to suggest that their quiet assistant had played a crucial role in preventing a major terrorist attack. Autumn, Dr. Novak said, approaching her desk with the kind of respect that had been absent for 3 years. I've received a request from the International Crisis Research Institute. They're looking for someone with your unique combination of linguistic skills and practical experience to help develop new approaches to conflict prevention. The position would allow you to remain in Prague while contributing to work that could prevent future situations like the one we experienced last year. Autumn looked up from the manuscript she'd been cataloging, a 16th-century text on diplomatic protocols that suddenly seemed relevant to contemporary international relations. For the first time in her adult life, she was being offered an opportunity that matched both her capabilities and her values. "Tell me more about the position," she said, no longer afraid that accepting challenges would force her back into a world of violence and manipulation. The offer represented exactly what she'd hoped to achieve: meaningful work that utilized her skills without requiring her to sacrifice her principles or her peace of mind. She was no longer hiding from her capabilities or being forced to use them for purposes she couldn't support. As she listened to Dr. Novak describe the Research Institute's mission, Autumn realized that her greatest success hadn't been preventing the terrorist attack. It had been learning that strength doesn't require sacrificing the possibility of peace, and that exceptional abilities are most valuable when they serve purposes chosen freely rather than imposed by others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.